Now, joining us to talk about both this election in the UK, the French election, and I guess we'll sort of stray into the United States of America as well just at the moment, is Dr Oliver Hartwich. Now, Oliver is the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. And I'm going to give a bit of a background to him before I do. Before he joined the initiative, he was worked for the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney. He was the chief economist at the Policy Exchange in London. He was an advisor in the UK House of Lords. He holds a master's degree in economics and business administration and a PhD in law from Bochum University in Germany. So he probably, while I'm introducing all that, probably knows what he's talking about. And he joins us now. Oliver, lovely to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Michael. Great to be with you.
Listen, I saw you got your PhD in law from a university in Germany. Are you born a German?
Yes. I was born in Germany. I lived in Germany for 28 years, and then I left. In the last 20 years, I spent in the the Commonwealth.
Yes, the Commonwealth, that's right. Well, of course, Germany had a spotty past, so no wonder. The amazing thing about the Germans, though, having visited your, previous country, is how well the Germans speak English. In fact, they speak English better than the English, don't they?
Well, we're trying, but you would never take the German out of me, and you will never get my German accent out of me. I'm trying really hard, but let's face it. The two languages are actually quite similar. When you say my shoe is brown in German, it would be mein Schuh ist braun. It's exactly the same. So the languages are, of course, linked, and I think for any German, it's relatively easy to pick up English. And by the way, I think for any English speaker, it would be a relatively ezy thing to learn German, despite all the prejudices about German being.
Yeah, no, that's true. I did German for 3 years, Oliver, at school. So, I found it was a really easy language to learn, and you're right, the similarities between that and English are pretty good. Having said that, we'll move on. You're in New Zealand now. You're obviously following the UK elections. I would suggest to you that this is probably the easiest result to determine. But can you explain to me really quickly why the Conservatives under Boris Johnson win a breathtaking election? 5 years ago, under a populist and very popular UK Conservative leader, and then 5 years later, and 2 leadership changes in the Conservatives, we're looking at the annihilation, near annihilation of the Conservative Party.
That's a long story, and I think it actually begins before Boris Johnson. It actually starts with David Cameron. So you mentioned that I worked in the UK. I did. I worked relatively briefly in the House of Lords, working for the Liberal Democrats, actually. And then I worked as chief economist at Policy Exchange, and that was a conservative Cameronite think tank. We were actually regarded at the time as David Cameron's think tank when he was opposition leader. And I understood what Cameron was trying to do with the Conservative Party back then. We're talking about 2005, onwards to 2010, when he became Prime Minister. The Tory party at the time was practically unelectable. They were seen as the nasty party. That was the words of Theresa May at a Conservative Party conference. So people didn't like them, and they voted against them in consecutive elections, ever since Tony Blair won in 1997 with a landslide. And the reason why people didn't like them, they were seen as a bit weird, stuck in the past, only talking about previous policy successes that happened under Margaret Thatcher. And the dislike of the Tories back then was such. I remember in 2005 we saw some polling after the election where people were asked, okay, this is a policy idea, what do you think? And then people said, this is a great idea. And then they were told this was actually a Tory party proposal. And then said, in which case, rather not. So it was that dislike of the Tories that Cameron spotted, and he thought, actually, we have to do something about that. We have to reposition the party. We have to kind of get out of this toxic image we have. And what he tried to do was to talk about other things the Tories at the time had neglected. So they were only talking at the time about taxes in Europe. Cameron said, no, we have to talk about all the other things as well, like housing, like education, like health, like policing, because otherwise we leave that to Labour and the Lib Dems. And so Cameron did that, and it was an attempt to detoxify the image. He also gave the party a new logo. He talked about climate change, he talked about gay marriage, about all sorts of trendy issues. And in a way, I understand why he was doing that. The problem with that was, nevertheless, that in doing all of this, the Tory party forgot actually who they were. Because they used to be a centre-right party that was broadly free market since the times of Margaret Thatcher, and under Cameron they forgot that. And to really exemplify the shift that happened with Cameron, he tried to even borrow from Tony Blair's rule book. So Tony Blair only made Labour electable by promising voters he would stick to Tory spending plans because people didn't trust Labour with money. And so Tony Blair said, no, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about with us because we will actually accept the Tories' spending plans. And now Cameron tried to do the opposite. He said, actually, you all think we are just a cold-hearted free market party, but you know what? We're sticking to Labour spending plans because we're not going into austerity. So the Tory party got completely repositioned under David Cameron. And then, of course, disaster struck. We had the global financial crisis, and suddenly they had to actually do proper economic policy for which they hadn't prepared. And that was the problem. The other problem with Cameron was his position on Europe. So Cameron, he was an advisor to Norman Lamont. Remember Norman Lamont? He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time of Black Wednesday. That was when Britain experienced the dark day, got kicked out of the European exchange rate mechanism. And it was basically then when the Tory party started having a civil war with itself on Europe. And Cameron observed this as an advisor to the Chancellor, so the Minister of Finance effectively in Britain, and he concluded, I think also quite correctly, that Europe is a toxic issue for the Tory party because there was such massive divides within the party and between the party and the rest of the country. And so Cameron, when he was party leader, concluded, actually, let's just not talk about Europe. This is toxic. The moment we start talking about it, we're doomed. And so he tried to avoid the issue. As opposition leader, it took him, I think, 2 or 3 years until he even gave a speech on Europe. And then as prime minister, again, for the first, I think, 3 years, we didn't hear anything from Cameron on Europe. And that led to the rise of UKIP because UKIP filled that gap. And UKIP, that was Nigel Farage back then, started talking about Europe and actually won the European Parliament election, and then forced Cameron's hand saying, okay, I'll promise you a referendum. Now, a bit of background here. Cameron at the time did not expect to be Prime Minister after the 2015 election because he was down in the polls. The best scenario you could see at the time he made the promise to hold the Brexit referendum was when he thought, okay, well, even if I am Prime Minister, I will not have an absolute majority. I will continue the Lib Dem coalition, and they will force me not to have the referendum because the Lib Dems are notoriously Europhile. And then disaster struck, and Cameron won an absolute majority. So suddenly he had to deliver on his promise and held that Brexit referendum, which he really tried to avoid and never really wanted. And then to compound that, of course,
he actually campaigned against it, didn't he?
He campaigned against it and lost. And so basically now we had a party that was completely divided on Brexit, on how to deal with it. The party was also void of any philosophy because Cameron had completely hollowed it out. And that was the position in which Theresa May first took over, and afterwards Boris Johnson, then briefly Liz Truss, and now Rishi Sunak. So if you trace all of this back, you can see the roots of all of this disaster now striking the Tories in the early days of the Cameron leadership after he became party leader in 2005. And today, I mean, nearly 20 years later, we are seeing the culmination of that strategic mistake.
Nevertheless, Oliver, from 2010 to this year, 2024, we've had 14 years, the first 5 with the Lib Dems, as you've noticed, but we've had 14 years of a Conservative or Tory government in the UK. Now, if they were so dreadful, as you're painting them currently, does that mean the Labour Party was worse?
Yes. In short, yes. I mean, 2019, the Boris Johnson election, which won him a landslide and actually made him basically break that red wall of Northern English seats, which were always Labour. The reason why Boris Johnson won this one, apart from his appeal, I mean, he's a very popular character, or he used to be, was he had an opponent in the Labour Party, that was Jeremy Corbyn, who was an unreformed socialist or communist. So he was so far to the left that he made it easy for any Tory leader to win this election, and especially someone as gifted as Boris Johnson. And basically that was the result he got in 2019. And I remember it well. At the time, there were plenty of people saying, look, this is such an emphatic victory for Johnson. The Tories will be in power for 10, if not 15 years, because Labour is now crumbling. And they have to really spend a long time rebuilding after that Corbyn disaster. But then they squandered all of that, and COVID, of course, didn't help, and all the sleaze affairs, and now the latest affair, the betting affair, didn't help. And for a long time, it was clear in the polls that the Tories would be heading for disaster, and that's exactly what we got today.